Doing something a little different this time, I decided it would be a great idea to show the typical equipment used by all three sides during the Imjin War. I'm Stefan, and this is, of course, Japan at War. So the first thing that should be mentioned is that this is simply going to be what the most common pieces of equipment that these men would carry. Not that there wasn't other equipment used, just that it wasn't common. Alright, so the first side that I thought that we would discuss is the Joseon or Korean side. So particularly in this war, from what I've been able to discover, is that not a lot of men had heavy armor. And sometimes none at all, as a lot of the levied or righteous armies, well, they just simply didn't have access to armor. And on top of that, there's not many surviving examples either. So what would a typical well-armed Korean foot soldier look like? Well, like this. He wears leather and sometimes high-quality iron or steel lamellar over multiple layers of thick cloth with some padding, bound together with leather. From what I've been able to tell, these scales were about 1 millimeter thick. He would also have an iron and sometimes steel helmet, though not always. The officers, officials, and cavalrymen would have access to a much higher quality of armor known as the Dujongya, which I admit I might be mispronouncing. The armor itself is like a combination of a European gambeson and brigandine, with iron and steel plates underneath at about 1 to 1.2 millimeters in thickness. There was also ones with brass scales over it too. It developed as a way for a horse rider to be able to use his bow effectively without being impeded. And before I move on to the weapons, I wanted to show you Ryu Songrong's actual armor. Okay, so probably the most used weapon that the Koreans would have used throughout this war would be their bow, or gakgung, which is a composite recurve bow made predominantly from horn and bamboo. Its size was actually perfect to be used on horseback while carrying other weapons or on foot. This weapon, more than any of the others, is the most culturally significant and only stopped being used in 1894. Another weapon worth mentioning was a flail called the pyongan. It was actually used mostly on horseback and would just flatten anyone that got hit from it. And it's actually a smart weapon, as you don't need to worry about edge alignment like you would with a saber. And I'm blanking right now which person in history said it, but they actually said that the flail was now one of the most important weapons of Korea, superseded only by the bow. Polearms obviously though would be used in this war. Two of the ones that were probably the most common was the jangsheng and the dangpa. The first one was a rather typical spear at about 4 meters long, while the second one was pretty interesting and had a trident-like blade. The reason is because the outer blades would actually prevent it from being stuck in an opponent, which is actually a pretty cool idea. Swords were also used mostly by the commanders, but I thought it'd be interesting that while looking up information, I found out that several of the blades were actually imported from Japan, and the designs of some of these swords, such as the Hwando, were actually inspired from the katana gotten by defeated Woku pirates. Okay, so now we move on to the Ming, which is actually an interesting subject, as most of the Ming troops that came over into Korea were heavy cavalrymen, and might have had the heaviest armor of all the soldiers fighting. Oh, by the way, I'm actually getting most of this information from Qinshiao Xinghua, and I really do hope I'm saying his name right. Anyway, he's the writer on the Great Ming Military blog spot. Go check it out and follow his Patreon. Seriously, go follow him. Anyway, There was a good number of scale and brigantine style armors that was used in this war by the Ming, called the Changshen Dajie, or long body great armor. And this is where it gets interesting, as the plates could actually be on the inside or on the outside of the cloth. And on top of that, these plates would be made of metal or leather, though I'd wager it was probably more like metal plate that was actually used in the Korean campaigns. The arms would often be covered by segmented steel covers, both full and half covered, and the helmet would also be made from steel with a neck guard. Sadly, there doesn't seem to be any surviving examples of this armor, but if I am wrong, please do link me down below or message me on Instagram. I would love to see it. Naturally, being mostly cavalrymen, they would actually use bows that were optimized for horseback and easy to store while riding. And if I'm not mistaken, there was a few different bows that could be used. But I think the Kaiyongong, or New Era bow, would probably be the most common use, and was capable of firing heavy arrows to great effect. Now these, obviously, well, there would have been several arrows that would have been used, and I'm just not going to spend the next hour describing them all. But as was mentioned in my video on the Battle of Byeokjigwan, we do know that they'd used rocket arrows known as Shenjajian. Another weapon that would have been used was a 3-barreled hand cannon, usually cast out of iron or lower grade steel. And the shot would actually be about the size of a dime, so it's pretty substantial. And when it ran out of shot, I imagine it'd make a pretty effective club too. This part is very hard for me to determine which is the most common, but it makes sense that the Fang Tianji, or square sky halberd, would be quite frequently used. But the Jiangqian, or line spear, which is a lightweight cavalry lance favored by the Ming in northern China, and considering the Ming commander-in-chief Li Rusong was from Liaodong, this makes a lot of sense. So what kind of swords would these elite cavalrymen carry? Well, while there's several that could have been used, the most common would be the Yao Dao, which was a pretty standard type of saber, and even when the Ming fell to the Qing, it would actually still be used even then. But wait, there is more. The Ming also brought several cannons as well to combat the Japanese. One of the most common would have been the Dajiangjong Bao, or Great General Cannon. Now, this wasn't a particularly heavy cannon due to how warfare in China was conducted, though that is a different discussion. Anyway, 2 were actually captured by the Japanese at the Battle of Byeokjigwan. The average bore size between these 2 was 11.6 millimeters, with the length at about 1.5 meters. They also made use of a mortar called the Hu Don Bo. Oh, before I forget, they also used breech-loading cannons called Fo Lang Shi, which were actually just reverse-engineered Portuguese guns, and these came in various sizes. Okay, so now we talk about the Japanese side, and I'm going to warn you. You're probably thinking of the super fancy samurai armor and lavish silk laced armor, wielding gorgeous, high-polished katana. And, well, no. The Japanese in this war, especially later on, would have had much less armor and even no armor due to there just not being an infrastructure in place to repair the armor as it took damage. And on top of that, these men would have been mostly of the Ashigaru class, or conscript infantry, more or less. So, what kind of armor would they have? Well, as we've just established that most of these men would have been Ashigaru, we can already start to rule out more expensive kits, as they would have had the most cost-effective equipment possible. And what would that have been? Well, the Hara-Ate would be a great candidate. Let's see if we can actually put a pic of that up on the screen. Okay, well, as you can see, it's a very simple dough, and it's literally just the front. Now obviously, this would have been incredibly cheap and easy to make. And that's not to say that this was the only piece of armor that the samurai gave their infantry. Several of these men would have been equipped with the full do, and I would wager that they were of the Okinawa variant. As far as headgear, the jingasa would be the most common, both made from iron or lacquered leather. Of course, there was several other helmets used, but they wouldn't be anywhere near as common as the jingasa in this war. As far as the arm and leg armor, if they had them, it would have been whatever was the cheapest on the market. Okay, now let's get into weaponry most commonly used by the Japanese. I think that the one weapon that should really come to no surprise at all is the teppo. There's quite a lot of variety, and there wasn't really any standard caliber, though I should say that the different commanders would have made sure that their separate armies would have had a great effort made to have a certain caliber specifically for them. Okay, moving on. It's going to come to a surprise to some, but yes, the Japanese warbow, or yumi, was used in this war, and contrary to popular YouTube belief, it was not weak. And I'm actually trying to raise money on my Patreon to do a comprehensive test to prove this. Anyways, it wasn't used nearly as much as the teppo was in this war, but there was still actually quite a lot used. And what about hand weapons? Well, the yari would have definitely been present. However, most of them would actually be of the su, or sangenkaku variant. And the poles would have actually been around 2 and 1.5 meters tall. And I haven't seen any evidence that the nagayari, which is around 5 to 6 meters usually, but sometimes longer, was used. Though it really would have been interesting had they had them. The last weapon requires a bit of quick history. In 1588, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, one of the 3 great unifiers of Japan, called for a katanagari, or sword hunt. His men would go through territories that were recently conquered and took any swords from the common folk that he could get his hands on. Now, Hideyoshi told these people that these would actually be melted down to create a giant image of the Buddha, but many of these weapons were actually stored away and then used to equip his men during the invasions. The most, I guess you'd say, valuable of them would not have been given to the ashiguru though. And I would say that the ones that were given to his men would have been in slightly questionable condition. All of these swords would be slightly different from the last, so I can't really give you any standard length. But yes, the katana was definitely very common in this war. Just, it wouldn't quite be the fancy blade that people usually think of. And this is where I will leave you. Make sure to hit that like button, and if you can, support real history by joining my Patreon. See you next time.